I think the classic conspiracy is outlined in the Kennedy assassination, where you have a situation that involves both information and disinformation, and in the very end, classification. In other words, what's really known is made top secret during the lifetime of those who are involved in it. Now, that's a real conspiracy. Now, one of the things I think that gets overplayed is what we call false flags. I've talked many times on the radio, and one of the things that I talk about is I think that we are facing in the future an economic collapse. I think that we are facing some very dark times here in America, regardless of the timing of, quote, the end time. In other words, Christ's return or a rapture or fulfillment of prophecies. Regardless of that, just our country, America, I think is in for a time of judgment. I think it's crossed the threshold, if you would, of where God has said enough is enough. As of the other day, I think the statistics were that since Roe versus Wade, some 53, and somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's 53 million babies have been aborted in this country. That's just staggering. And I'm always reminded of what Billy Graham said. He said that if God didn't judge Los Angeles, he'd have to apologize to Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, I think often when I think about that, I also think about the fellow that was in New York. He died recently. David Rookerson. And he always talked about judgment coming. I wish, in a way, he could have lived to have seen it, but he talked often about judgment. And I think judgment is coming. I don't think that I or anybody else can put a finger on how long it takes to get here. But I think that one of the things that will take place, well, let me rephrase that. I try not to look at things like the Boston Marathon. I don't think the government's behind anything like that. I think the conspiracy, like I mentioned, is on a huge, large scale. And I think that when the government moves in a manner to take liberties away from the people, which I think is coming one day, I think it will be done on a, quote, large scale. In other words, there'll be maybe some nuclear catastrophe or something that's large enough that they can justify martial law. And I think these things that happen in the interim are things that we see where the police, this Capitol Hill thing that's happened recently with the woman in the car that had the turtle in the back seat, and she was shot to death because she ran into the barricade there at the White House. It's just an overuse of force. And we're seeing that more and more across America. I don't think things like that or even Sandy Hook or conspiracies, I think if the government were involved in it, you would have certain characteristic things. You would have information, disinformation. You would also have things classified as top secret. For instance, as happened in the Kennedy assassination. Today, things have not come out and been told about what really happened. It's still a conspiracy of the conspiracies. But my point, I guess, tonight is in making and saying all of this is I don't think we should be caught up in small affairs to the point that we overlook the fact that there's a large conspiratorial move by fallen angels dealing with world governments to bring in a new world order. And part of this will involve things that go on in the Middle East, but it'll certainly also involve our country and the loss of liberties that we enjoy today. And we're beginning to see on a small scale this begin to take place. So I guess what I'm, again, summarizing is to say this: in all of the small things that we see happening on Facebook and the world today, let's don't lose focus on the fact that the final is to bring the entire world into a polarization of a one-world government, a one-world religion, and one-world monetary system, which, as I mentioned, I feel a full, quote, disclosure will be part of that, because that will, in effect, change the world's religious base without question. And that may be the key pivotal thing in creating the whole affair. Anyway, that's what I had to say tonight. Do we have any questions? All right, Wayne, I know at least you've got a question in there.
Well, I just find it interesting that the Queen of Heaven is mentioned so often in Scripture, and I have wondered in the past, whether that's there's a male fallen angel stronghold that's behind that, or if in some weird way there is actually a feminine entity of some type like that does not serve God and works through some of the powerful women of the world. No offense to women at all, but you go back like Semiramis and stuff like that, they have been empowered.
Well, that would be an interesting concept in a way, but angels are always spoken of in a masculine way.
Right.
But again, you have the whore of Babylon.
Mm-hmm.
And I've talked about this before. I think America is Mystery Babylon.
Mm-hmm.
Time will tell.
Yep.
But I don't think the book of Revelation is talking about an actual fulfillment of the physical Babylon, or else it would have said Babylon instead of Mystery Babylon.
Mm-hmm. There is a difference.
There certainly is. And I think anytime the feminine is used in that, it's probably referring to maybe it could be I'll just venture out here and say this: angels are always in the masculine,
mm-hmm.
but I don't think demons are always in the masculine.
Interesting.
Because I think demons are the disembodied spirit of the Nephilim.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the interesting thing about the Nephilim is that they are called, in Genesis, the 6th chapter, men.
Mm-hmm.
And if they're called men, we can assume they have reproductive capability.
Mm-hmm.
So had a Nephilim reproduced with a human, or as such, there would have been created another partial hybrid.
Mm-hmm.
And in some of the ancient writings, that in fact states that did happen, and they're called the Eloid, and
mm-hmm.
their children are called the LJ.
Mm-hmm.
Interestingly enough, they could have been male and female, where the Nephilim seem to have been only male.
Right. Although it's surprising, there are some of those that are in giants research who say that even the giants can't have female offspring. But if you look back at the writings, I don't think that bears up. There were at least some. Perhaps they were in a minority, but it just seems like there had to be some.
Yeah, I think when they mated with humans, they could produce an offspring that could be female or male. But they themselves obviously were always male.
I have one quick comment that I'd like to make about end times that you talked about in another virtual church. If you remember, I hold very strongly with your theory about that giant planet Rahab. I just find it interesting. You can't really make too much out of it, but I find it very interesting that broke up, and you have that meteoric rock probably came from Rahab. And if you go through the different occult sciences, for lack of a better term, a lot of them want to use or look for making items out of that meteoric rock. And it goes with swords, different spells, potions, all kinds of different things have that. I just find that interesting.
Even King Arthur's sword, I think, we're supposed to have a meteorite. Mm-hmm.
Right, so I mean, it's probably pieces of the planet Rahab floating around.
Well, yeah, that's interesting. And for some of you that might not be aware of this, if you go to fallenangelstoday.com, that's one of my websites, and if you'll type in Rahab, it'll bring up an article about what Wayne's talking about. And there's a possibility that the asteroid belt was originally a planet, and that it was broken up from God's wrath. And the assumption there is that there's one or two verses that possibly could be referring to it. And if that be the case, the word Rahab comes from the word boaster or pride, and could very well be a link to the fact that it may have been Lucifer's throne or home world, if you would. And what Wayne and I also have talked about, I've written about it in my books, that prior to his fall, he probably was in charge of commerce throughout the solar systems and the galaxies, perhaps. There's writings in Ezekiel that state that the actual pride he was guilty of was that of merchandise. Because of I believe it the way it phrased, there was the multitude of merchandise, which is buying, selling, trading. And if you think out of the box about what it's talking about, it begins to make sense that there could have been an angelic civilizations that he was over or in charge of, and that part of the fall on his part could have been wanting the entire if you're talking about like in mafia terms, he wanted to take over everything. He wanted to be the Godfather. I think that probably sort of gives a human understanding of the subject. But of course we know that he got booted out rather than getting what he wanted. But that may give a little bit more understanding as to what his objective was. And when you look at that and the fact that the entire solar system is pockmarked by asteroid hits, and, it begins to make sense that judgment probably took place on whatever planet that he was on, which could likely be where the asteroid belt was. Some modern science data does suggest that there was a planet there at one time. And, of course, that would make sense that the solar system would be bombarded by pieces of this, causing probably what we see in Genesis 1:2, the earth was without form and void. It was probably the destruction of what took place here on earth as well, whatever civilizations, angelic civilizations, or whatever that happened to be on the earth. Anybody else have a question?
Yeah, I do. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. In relation to these fallen angels, which you apparently know quite a bit about, and I'm pretty much a novice with it, and it's also in regards to this Whore of Babylon and what cities it may apply to. Now, I'm of the belief that these are largely spiritual things. In other words, this city, whether it be D.C. or New York or, like you said, Los Angeles or Tel Aviv or Jerusalem or whatever city it may be, that it can change, and people have the power to move that location or that spirit. In other words, we've seen it, like you mentioned earlier, a turn towards the darker side of things in these last 5-6 years, where it could very easily be said that, D.C. is this War of Babylon. It doesn't, it don't necessarily have to be a woman in specific unless, we, God forbid, had a woman president down there right now. But it could, cities are often referred to as she. Ships are also referred to, and we call it the feminine.
Right.
Now,
New York stands out particularly in that it's got the Statue of Liberty. Many writers have talked about New York specifically and America in general.
Well, I would have to think that the head of the beast, which would also be referring to the same thing, would be our capital. Okay, now though something may have started in New York City, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's what we're referring to in this Bible, because it was not even, America wasn't even founded back then. So most of these things had to do with the Middle East, and most of the scriptures, from my understanding, had to do with the Middle East. However,
I would agree with that. I believe that the book of Revelation itself is Middle East centric, Jerusalem centric to be exact. But go ahead, yes.
You're right. Yes, I agree with you there. However, like I said, these are spirits we're talking about. We're not talking about 1, 2, 3, or 4. We're talking about literally probably hundreds of these things in various different places that may or may not even be aware that they are doing what they're doing. In other words, lots of people refer to Barack as, he's a destroyer. I myself have said that. He is destroying the peace that we enjoy. But that doesn't mean he's aware of what he's doing. He firmly believes that that's what that's what he's going to do. He doesn't think he's propagating any evil by, universal health care or taking these steps towards this new one world order that you were referring to.
Mm-hmm.
He believes that, hey, there's somebody out there who doesn't have health insurance, and we're obligated to give it to them. Okay.
Well, I would like to think that you're right, and I hope you are right.
Oh,
because the evil would be much greater if he was aware of it.
Yeah, I believe that he is setting a foundation for which this evil could come about. In other words, if you take the United States of America and our military out of the equation, you could very easily set up a one world order. Very, I shouldn't say easily, but you could see a new world order coming about. In other words, if we weren't forwardly deployed all over the planet because of a collapse of some sort, like whether, God forbid, it be a 1929 thing, or for whatever reason, we weren't projecting forwardly in a military capacity, that would allow for somebody else to come up and be the new police of the planet, so to speak.
Well,
now, all this spending, CK, is laying a foundation for this to happen. Okay, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I see, and I think there are many things laying the foundation for it to happen. I do think that, you mentioned the 1920s. One of the things that has really spoken to me is if you figured unemployment the same way mathematically that you did in the 1930s during the Great Depression, and you counted the unemployed the same way, we today have the same percentage of unemployment. We monkey with the figures today to make them much less than they really are. And that's a well-known fact. It's just not talked about. In fact, we don't even count a person unemployed until they've been unemployed for a year. You talk about cooking the books. That's really cooking the books.
I know.
1930s, you were counted unemployed if you didn't have a job. So America is looking at implosion. Now, how long that can be put off, I don't know. I hope it's put off through my lifetime. But I sincerely don't think that's going to be the case. When I talk on the radio across the country, I urge believers to prepare, to set aside food, get out of the stock markets, put investments in tangibles.
You mentioned the stock market. You mentioned the stock market, and I heard from a couple different sources that our Treasury Department was actually buying shares of stocks in various companies to keep that number artificially inflated.
Well, there's some of this is over my head, and I wouldn't dare tell you it wasn't. But one of the things to me that is show and tell, if you look at what they call the volume of trading that takes place. Well, 50 years ago, that was probably an indicator. But today, with computers that buy and sell in microseconds, it doesn't really mean anything anymore. So there are a lot of things that just lead you up to say, when is this all going to collapse around their ears? And like I said, I don't think things will collapse until there's something to replace it with. And, my call of the hour, so to speak, is there is an alien disclosure coming. Howbeit, they will be demonic entities. But if you think about this, let's just use that.
I said you mentioned that, and and whether it would be a hybrid or what kind of a creature this might be, whether it's they've somehow artificial intelligence has evolved to a point where we actually believe these things are foreign or from another planet, and how much of a bearing would that even have on our planet, lest we let it? Okay.
Well, all right. Take for instance the flying saucer, so to speak, which is a technology because they show up on radar, then they disappear in thin air. But let's say the flying saucer shows up on the White House lawn and fallen angels walk out of it. They don't say they're fallen angels, they say they're aliens.
That'd be awesome.
Now, huh?
I said that would be awesome if that happened.
Well, that would change the world religious picture overnight. Because they would be preaching what I call the alien gospel. And if you're familiar with what that is, that means that they, quote, aliens, seeded mankind, that there was no God. But now when I go on shows that believe that, I always argue the straw man argument about, well, okay, that's true then, but who created them? But anyway, the point being, it would shatter, and you can almost rest assured they will have the kind of technology that will call into question all of our biblical beliefs. And it will form in of itself. It talks about in Thessalonians that there's coming a falling away and that the very elect themselves could almost be deceived. And that's a paraphrase. But, there's coming something that is going to be so tangibly different that if a person doesn't have a grasp or hold on their faith, they would be swayed by it. And I think that's what this is. It would be full disclosure. It will certainly change the paradigm of the world's beliefs overnight.
Depending on what they said, and that would also give people from this earth pause to forward that investment that it would take to put on something such as you're mentioning. I mean, I see a lot of stuff about aliens and ancient aliens and all that, and it's not really, a specialty of mine or anything like that. And I would think that, maybe we would get some intelligence or some information from them, whether we would believe them necessarily or not. You seem to think they would be charismatic and say that they were some kind of Nephilim, or they were.
No, I think a fallen angel is involved, and part of what they have been doing is a hybrid program dealing with what we would call Nephilim. But fallen angels specifically are also involved in it, and will be, as it talks about in Revelations, the 13th chapter, they're going to be kicked out of heaven. They're going to fall to the earth. So they're going to come with a great deception. It's not going to be, oh, well, hello, I ended up here and I've been kicked out of heaven.
Okay, I still don't totally understand those guys, but that's okay. Maybe eventually I'll catch on.
Well, it amounts to the fact that fallen angels always use deception. They've showed up in times in history past. They've called themselves aliens or star gods in the past. I mean, that's documented. They've showed up in cultures all over the world throughout ancient history. And they've played with the genetic makeup of mankind. I don't think there's any question about that. Genesis 6:4 talks about the Nephilim, which was half human and half fallen angel. But then it goes on in Genesis to talk about all flesh had corrupted its way upon the earth, which indicates to me that these fallen angels didn't stop with just human women. They made it with animals. And that would explain the hieroglyphs that you see in ancient culture, like the Egyptian hieroglyphs, the Sphinx I mentioned earlier.
Okay.
And that would explain a couple of occurrences of lion-headed men that are talked about in 2nd Chronicles. So what I expect to see in full disclosure is more human-looking stuff, but yet some a little bit foreign-looking as well. But I think that these angels have been working on this thing for 6,000 years to be more human-like. And I've also written about this, is the Antichrist himself, I think, will be fathered by Lucifer and a human woman. I think he will be a Nephilim himself. And I think that's the reason in Revelation it really sort of brings home the fact that he's a man. But anyway, that's a different story and a different time to talk about. So we've taken up an hour tonight. If anybody else has a question, we'll take it real quick. If not, we'll call it a night.
Well, if you got 4,000 years since the flood to create Nephilim, wouldn't you think that they would have a few billion of them by now and they'd just go ahead and conquer the world anytime they feel like it?
There's some writers that think that there is an entire Nephilim army in the spiritual realm waiting to come into the physical realm. And there's also some writers that think that the Battle of Armageddon will consist of hybrids and humans. So that is a possibility. But I don't think that it's become a major thing in 1948. And I would say it was probably a third incursion. But that's my opinion.
Or why didn't they just go ahead and conquer the world when there was a lot smaller population? Because, until 1850 or whatever, there's hardly less than 1 billion people on the whole planet. Why didn't they just conquer it then,
Well, I think that was part of Lucifer's plan in the 6th chapter of Genesis. And it was obviously his plan to corrupt the genetics of mankind, because it mentioned that Noah was perfect in his generations. And the Hebrew word there is pure, without spot or blemish. It's the same one used of the sacrificial lamb. And it's very odd that it would mention his generations. So we can infer from that Noah and the ones that went on the ark their genetics were not corrupted. So, in a way, you could say that the evil that was on the earth spawned by these Nephilim is why God destroyed it. So it came very close. Lucifer came very close to conquering mankind then. And for some reason, there wasn't as large of an incursion after that when Israel went into Canaan land. But interestingly enough, God told Israel to kill every man, woman, and child. And there were about 12 tribes, I think, of giants at that time. And Israel was told to destroy all of them, but actually didn't destroy all of them. So why that didn't become the major, as large of an incursion as the first one, I don't know. And I don't know how large this next one will be either. But it could be large. But I think the nature of it will be deceptive. Not so much that they will try to